What is your best met the high school beach slash bully as an adult story? I ran into a high school classmate a while back. I've posted this before but it bears repeating. A guy in high school just didn't like me and I him. We got into a big damn fight. He broke my nose and I knocked a couple of his teeth out, off campus. No police were involved, but about 10 years later I saw him sleeping on the street near where I worked. I woke him up and asked him what was going on. He told me about his life after high school. He knocked up his girlfriend. Her parents made them get married, divorce a year later. He got into drugs and ended up alienating everyone. I asked him if he was still using, and he said no, he couldn't buy a dose anyway. I felt bad for him, so I asked if he'd like to stay in my guest house, a one-room cottage, set up like an efficiency apartment, for a while. He took me up on it and got a night's sleep in an actual bed for the first time in years, his words. I bought him some clothes and fed him for about a month until I found him a job with a contractor I was doing some work for. Long story short, it's been 6 years. He now owns a contracting business, has a wife and a new baby boy, and just bought the house down the street from me. Edit. Thanks for the gold. Edited. Hey guys, I'm really appreciative of all the support and I'd like to ask you all for one thing. Pay it forward. If you can help, do it. Even if it's a small favor, the repercussions of good deeds tends to ripple out. Let's make this a big splash. Edit. Due to some questions regarding the times I've posted this, I have posted this story 3 times on Reddit. I didn't do it for the karma, but it is nice, rather to inspire others, to maybe take a moment and help each other. My then fiancé took me out to dinner in my hometown, where we had our first date, to celebrate my new promotion. I recognized our waitress right away as the girl who had been mean to me in 6th and 7th grade, the only years we had classes together. She didn't seem to recognize me. I had gained a lot of weight and the restaurant was dark, so I let it go and treated her like any other waitress. When the bill came I asked my now husband how we should tip. She was a great waitress and deserved a generous tip like we usually do, but the urge to stiff her was there as payback. I decided to tip her generously and let the past go. But I did leave a note next to the tip. Here's to believing that people did grow up after high school. And I signed it class of 20 ***. Quote, the next day I got on Facebook and she had sent me a message. She said she had recognized me, but I looked happy, so she said nothing and she treated me like any other customer. Then she apologized for anything she might have done to me in school. It was a hard time for her, and she didn't like to think about who she was then. Some bullies do grow up, and I'm glad we both did the right thing. When I was a kid, I was fat. I used to get picked on all the time by this kid at church named Rusty. He was about 5 years older than me, and every couple of weeks he would beat me up. I moved away when I was about 14, and thankfully, I didn't have to deal with him anymore. When I went to college, I decided to get my act together and get healthy. To that end, I started taking mixed martial arts. I did it for about 2 years, and lost about 40 pounds. When I graduated, I moved back to where I was from, and started looking for a new MMA gym. I went to the most reputable one, and who should be there but Rusty. It sounds too good to be true, but I swear to God, it happened. He hadn't changed a bit. The first thing he said to me was, finally trying to learn to defend yourself. I had called ahead, and the instructor knew my deal, and had arranged for me to come watch. I left my gear in the car. At the end of class, they do free rolling, jujitsu sparring. Rusty comes up to me, having no knowledge that I'm the least bit experienced, and starts begging the instructor to let him spar me so he can show me the ropes. After all, he's been in MMA for 3 months now, and he never misses a UFC pay-per-view. I went outside and changed. Long story short, we sparred, and I choked him out 3 times. Afterwards, I signed up for classes. He grabbed his bag, left, and never came back. This is my favorite story out of everything that has happened in my life thus far. I'm the only person I know that got to beat up my childhood bully as an adult. Sorry if this seems sparse. I'm on mobile. Edit. Holy crap. I made this post this afternoon and get back to my computer to see this totally blow up. Thanks a lot for the encouragement everyone, and thanks for the Reddit gold. Ours was extremely smart and very athletic. He was an incredible wrestler and undefeated throughout high school. I saw him at a party at a friend's house randomly, and we caught eyes a few times and eventually we just approached each other and said hello, exchanged bro hugs. Mind you, we hardly talked. The only time we really did was when I told him to stop picking on someone and told me he would kick my ass instead. He was a lovely guy. Anyway, he hadn't changed one bit. He tried to pick fights with people throughout the night and kept looking at me while he was in yelling matches with people. So I kept getting in between him and the other person, telling them both to calm down. This happened a few times until it started getting a little physical and he looked at me again. So I stood up and he tried to push the guy one more time. So I grabbed him by his shoulders and started pushing him back, telling him to cool it, and I thought, what the fuck am I doing? He is an angry wrestler that can take me down. Once I got him back a ways and told him to knock it off, he just looked at me and said, you know what I could do to that guy, but I don't want to. Please, stop me. It was the saddest hold me back bro moment I have ever been a part of. It was odd that he kept looking for me to stop his fights, but I was glad I was that guy for a bit. I own my own gym and have for a few years now. I received a message one day from a familiar looking name on the business Facebook page from a woman asking to come try us out. We set it up. She comes in for an introduction. She's a very large and out of shape woman at this point. After about 5 minutes of working with it hits me that this lady used to be about half her current size and was an absolute B_ in her heyday. I decided not to bring it up to her as she appeared to be struggling in life and came to us in a time of need, and I took it, as I do with all of my clients, as a cry for help. Not to mention, I'm a grown man now, and that seemed pretty silly and insignificant in life today. Months later, during one of the classes, I noticed her struggling real hard, so I go over to offer some encouragement. As I lean down to say something to her, I notice she's crying faintly to herself. She looks up at me and quietly says, sorry for how nasty I was to you years ago, and thank you for doing this for me. Turns out an old mutual friend told her about my place and she recognized me as the owner and came to me on purpose. No, not a story of revenge or attribution, but she reached out to someone she was terrible to, and today she's repurposed, and I find it to be quite inspiring. I was never really picked on in high school, besides the fact that I was years behind everyone in growth. Late bloomer, I guess you could say. I was part of the cool people clique. Although I was generally nice to everyone, I did let my popularity go to my head a few times and would treat a few guys in some of my classes like they were my minions or servants. As I grew up as a person, I realized how much of a faking tool I was and felt terrible about it for years. It just so happens that 2 of the main guys I picked on were gay and are now life partners with each other. I instantly recognized them coming at an expensive place I was taking my girlfriend out to eat for our anniversary. They didn't make reservations and there was at least hour wait. We had just been seated, but I instantly knew this was my time to say I was sorry. So after a few minutes of explaining to my girlfriend why I needed to do this, I called them over, told them to take our seats and how sorry I was for being a dickbag to them in high school, wished them luck, and paid for their dinner and dessert. Me and my girlfriend decided to get some fast food and go for a picnic. 2 weeks later, I got a message from both of them saying that that was the nicest thing anyone has ever done for them and they forgive me for all the times I treated them like shit. I live in the deep south, where being gay is heavily unaccepted. 2 months after that, I got a wedding invite. One of the coolest weddings I have ever been to, and so glad that's how it all played out. Kendall was the littlest shad bully. His older brother Adrian was my friend. Kendall made my life in high school a living hell. Lots of teasing and stuff. He beat the crap out of me in the gym lockers one winter, took my clothes, and left me to walk home naked. But Adrian and I joined the army together. Years later, Adrian was in my unit, different platoon, and was killed in Iraq. I volunteered to fly with his body back home for his family. Kendall never showed up, not even to the funeral. I heard that he was shacked up with some coco downtown, so I went over there kicked in the door, dragged Kendall out by his hair, and pushed and kicked and dragged him the 2.5 miles to the cemetery, where I had buried his brother that morning, berating him on how horrible of a person he was. Kendall was a bloody mess by the time we got to his brother's grave. I beat the ungodly shit out of him, right on the freshly turned dirt, then I left him there. A year later, on the anniversary of Adrian's death, I returned to his grave. Kendall was waiting on me. He was cleaned up and sober and apologized to me incessantly. After lunch, he asked me to take him down to the recruiter's office to join up and make his brother proud. This was one of the greatest moments in my life. My dad is a very large man. We're talking 6 feet 7 inches, 300 pounds big. He would always tell me this story to cheer me up when girls would be bitches to me. He was pretty chubby in high school, so he played football and was good at it, but just really loved playing basketball. So his freshman year he tried out for the team and didn't make it. The coach, who was a history teacher at the school, stated his weight as an issue. Fair enough, he worked hard to lose some weight over the summer, blah blah blah. Enter sophomore year, ends up having the coach as his history teacher. Great. He thinks he can be a good student and hopefully get on the team. Wrong. This adult man decided to call my father names related to his weight and harass him in front of the class. Not cool, but my dad was too proud and never said anything. Ended up making varsity his sophomore year because of a coaching change. Fast forward about 5 years, my dad was working as a bouncer at a bar in a nearby town to where he went to school. It was a regular night when who walks in? Jackass history teacher. Perfect. He thinks I'll let it go, be professional. Until he recognizes my dad as a chubby kid who was a coward. My dad looks at him and says, "Sir, I think you've had too much to drink. It's time for you to go home." The coach is saying, No, I'm fine, etc. My dad grabs him by his shirt and says, "No. It's time for you to step outside. You have had too much to drink." The coach decides to swing at my dad, and that's when he loses it. He states, "This is for all the kids you've called fat, you piece of shit," and proceeds to beat the tar out of him. A long story, I know, but my favorite by far. My dad and his old bouncer friends always tell it when they got together too. Our revenge. Edit grammar, and noting that my dad wasn't 6 feet 7 inches as a freshman, but more like 6 feet 3 inches. Still tall though. I definitely didn't take the high road here, but it was fantastic when I was bouncing. I saw my ex-bully walk into my bar. This guy made my high school life hell through every method except violence. I was bigger than him by a fair margin. I knew he lived a couple towns over. This was small town New Zealand after all. I also knew he was driving. I looked for his car, and it was parked in a tow-away area. I gleefully called the company who handles this for us, and they towed it. He was in the pub at the time. He was none the wiser. I also got one of our glasses to follow him around and take his glass every time he put it down for more than 5 seconds. It was pretty busy that night and he wasn't overly bright, so again he was none the wiser. After a few hours of this, he came outside for a smoke where it was pouring rain and afterwards turned around to go back inside. I blocked his way and he tried to shove past me. I told him he was acting aggressively and I wouldn't be letting him back in. He started shouting that he'd left his wallet inside. I told him that if he'd thought of that before trying to shove past me, maybe I would have gone to get it for him. At this point, in his eyes, I stopped being a bouncer and was again the scared little 17-year-old from 7 years earlier. He took a swing at me, missed, and fell over in the gutter. He wasn't drunk. It was just that the ground was wet and he slipped. We had a couple of cops who used to come in for a few drinks off duty every now and again, and they happened to be smokers. They saw what had happened and called their buddy who was on duty and he swung by, picked this jerk up, and threw him in the drunk tank. I'm not proud of my feelings about this, but seeing the guy who destroyed high school for me getting thrown into the drunk tank, after being ripped off at a pub, getting humiliated while trying to look like the big man, being sober enough to be hugely frustrated over this whole thing, and knowing that when he gets out of the drunk tank in the morning, his car won't be where he'd left it made me feel great. I never messed with him again after that. I felt we were even. At the tender age of 14, and standing a bit over 5 feet tall, I was sent to boarding school. I had braces, a body perm, and weighed not more than 70 pounds. About as scared as a rabbit in a thunderstorm, I kept my head low and tried to stay under the radar. A group of older girls somehow noticed me anyhow and began harassing me, at first in small ways such as making snide remarks, but quickly escalating to physical abuse. Walking back to the girls' dorm after class, my heart rate would increase as I planned out my route through the lobby and up the stairs to my room. Much of the time, I'd get intercepted, and if nobody else was around, pinned to the ground and given sailor taps while being laughed at. One of the girls in particular seemed to really have it out for me, and long after the others lost interest, she'd still openly make fun of me and corner me at every opportunity for a bit of physical abuse. I'd lie in my bed at night conjuring all sorts of scenarios in which I could humiliate her. It was all for naught, though, as morning would come, and I'd still be the nerdy little kid who'd be wise not to try anything. She'd still be the big boobed popular girl who walked around pulling a wake of disciples in her path point many years later, now standing well over 6 feet tall, and known within my circle of business as an attractive woman who was not to be messed with. I scheduled a lunch meeting with a few possible vendors, to be located at the shopping mall I was helping develop. Seated with representatives from Radio Shack, Sears, and a few others, our waitress approached the table. She was a wreck of a woman, crispy fried bleached blonde hair, pock-marked complexion, and cheap clothing stretched over a body several pounds too large for it. As she fumbled around for a pen in her apron, our eyes met, and it would be difficult to describe what was exchanged wordlessly as we recognized each other. The tables had turned dramatically. Vengeance was mine. I said it was nice to see her after all these years, and that I couldn't think of anyone I'd be happier to have as my server. The meeting went well, table service was impeccable, and I left a tip equal to our tab for the meal. Haven't seen her since, but now when I think of her I get all warm and tingly with the deliciousness of winning. For those of you asking what sailor taps are, I also googled it to no avail, and have to believe that we made the term up. Can't find it anywhere. We use that phrase to describe someone pinning you down and rapping repeatedly on your sternum using their knuckles. Hurt like a beach and left my chest violently discolored and painful for days after. /u/Blackadelac explains history of the term. When somebody receives a warfare designator in the Navy, they get a little metal warfare device decoration pinned to their uniform at the collarbone level. It's a hush-hush Navy tradition for people to slap or punch the new pin on the person's chest throughout the day and say congratulations. The little metal spikes that attach the pin to the uniform are driven into the receiving party's collarbone. In today's Navy they call it tacking on the pin. The older term that moved to the civilian world is sailor tap. TLDR, sailors like amuse themselves by punching each other's metallic warfare decorations into each other's chests. Sailor tap _enjoy tells how he used it. What you described as sailor taps is what I was taught in the military to check if someone was faking being dead/unconscious/asleep. That shit hurts, and you gotta be a pro to not respond to it. Same. I got teased mercilessly, and by friends of a family member of mine who was in my grade, and never stuck up for me. They were all really popular. I still don't know why. They're all still jackasses, but they were generally pretty smart. I thought it was because they sucked up to teachers and all played sports, but it wasn't. When we all went off to college, they went to a school really close to home that almost everyone went to. It was like a repeat of high school. I wasn't touching that with a 10-foot pole. And I went out of state with literally no one within 20 miles of my high school. Fast forward 4 years, they're all graduated and getting jobs, and I got suspended as a super senior and have to wait an extra year to graduate. I just got dumped. They're all having long-term relationships and engagements, and I'm struggling to find more than a part-time job in order to support myself. I see them at the bar sometimes, or just around town, and I get angry every time. I try as hard as I can, and they are still better than I am. I've heard the conversations they have, and there's maybe 2 nice girls in their entire friend group, and only 1 nice guy. Sorry for this wall of text. I haven't really talked about most of this in a while. That felt good. I was embarrassed by an older boy when I was in 7th grade. He thought I had been throwing sunflower seed at him at lunch. He calmly got up with his tray of pizza and french fries with ketchup and threw it in my face. I ran to the bathroom as 200 kids laughed at me. Later, when we were both sat down in the principal's office, I actually broke down and cried when asked to explain what had happened. Kid laughed and later told his friends. It took a good couple years before people stopped picking on me about this. Worst moment of my entire school career. Flash forward a decade. I'm at an outdoor concert in a park. I see that faking kid again, only now, we are both grown up. He's not so big anymore. I felt a drunken rage rise in me. I walked over to him. My plan was to sucker punch him in the side of the head and walk away. But then, I caught sight of his sister. She recognized me and said hey. We all ended up talking and catching up. I got the dude work with my brother. I guess he was kind of broke. His sister thought that was kind of cool of me. We ended up dating for about 6 months. I'd like to say I felt immense satisfaction every time I slipped my penis inside her, not only because I was getting laid, but because it was my school bully's sister. I didn't, though. I knew we had changed, and I realized that I just wasn't angry anymore. Growing up, my wife had a cat that would go everywhere with her. It would ride on the handlebars of her bike and in her backpack. The two were inseparable. Then one day the cat disappeared. A couple days later in school a kid came up to her and told my wife he'd shot the cat with his bow. The cat screamed and screamed, he said. And he laughed. Broke my wife's heart. She still doesn't know where / if the cat is buried. Fast forward a couple years later, the bully has found God and is a preacher. My wife shows up to one of his services, stands up in the middle of his sermon, and asks if he remembers how he tortured her cat when she was a little girl. Everyone is speechless. The bully stammers. My wife tells everyone that the man standing before them, preaching about love and kindness, murdered her favorite pet and made her childhood a living hell. Edit 1 from what she describes. He looked mortified and stammered and started tearing up. He may have just been embarrassed or truly apologetic, we don't know. But my wife isn't one to forgive and forget so easily, believe me, especially when it comes to an event that still haunts her. She waited for him to respond, but he remained silent and just sort of helplessly shook his head, mouth agape. My wife kind of nodded and left it at that. She walked out, but is fairly certain he didn't finish his sermon that day. I don't know if she's run across him since, but she says that from the look of terror in his eyes she'd gotten her point across. She feels a little better, but not knowing exactly what happened to that cat still tears at her. Edit 2 thanks for the gold. Posting from Alien Blue, so hopefully this replies in the right spot. Don't want to leave you all hanging. I'll also ask her, when she gets home, if he ever apologized. He may have written her a letter. I'll update. Update texted my wife explaining that the internet loves her, but demands to know if the guy who killed her cat ever apologized. She says he did reach out to her via Facebook to apologize after the church incident. He said he regrets what he did. Apparently after killing the cat, he would taunt my wife relentlessly. He told her he shot it with a bow, then buried it while it was still screaming. I didn't know that part. So, he did apologize and say that he's changed. My wife says she thanked him for his apology, but that she did not forgive him, nor would she ever forgive him. She has moved on and is happy, but she would never forget the pain he caused her. And she is happy he supposedly changed, but she hopes his actions continue to haunt him and serve as a reminder that no matter how good and decent he may be today, he's still the monster in her nightmares. Moved to a new school in 7th grade and was doing fine, making friends, good grades. Then somehow ran afoul of this bigger kid. He'd been held back a few times. Typical bully, pushed little kids into lockers, loved to torment girls, and ran with a pack of acolytes who adored and aped him. In Texas at the time, if a kid didn't like you, he called you out, challenged you to a fight after school. Well, Zed calls me out one day because I was a faggot from New York. Clueless me, moved there from said New York, where people are civilized. I said, sure, okay, Few days later, in front of his acolytes and a small group of my friends, he proceeds to beat the shit out of me. It was 7th grade, so the damage wasn't excessive, mostly to my pride. Spent the rest of middle school known as one of the guys Zed beat the shit out of. Fast forward about 7 years, home from college, and going to the grocery store for mom, Who should I see bagging my goodies but Zed? Taking a look at him, I see a horrible scar running from the top of his head down around the back of his skull and neck, and under his shirt. His face lights up when he sees me, and he says, in slightly slurred speech, "Hey, didn't we go to school together? We are friends from school, right?" He walks with me out to the parking lot, and as we walk I learn that he had been hit by a car in high school while biking home one day. Accident required a half dozen surgeries and had left Zed mentally impaired and a completely different person. He put my stuff in the car, shook my hand for a good 30 seconds, and kept asking me to come back and see me sometime. I had hated few people in my life to that point, and no one more than him. Almost cried driving home. I felt so bad for him and disgusted with myself for my previous hatred. One of mine was this kid named Patrick. One incident led to 2 of my ribs being broken when he jumped on my chest with his knees. Another resulted in a broken eye socket after being kicked in the face by him and 2 of his friends. Eventually I moved in with my father and didn't see any of my old bullies again except for a few. Some have been relatively nice and some are sheetheads. During high school I filled out a bunch and took some martial arts classes, taekwondo. I was always a larger kid, but too timid to fight back, but martial arts helped me overcome that point. Fast forward to a year or 2 after high school and I go over to visit my mother. She had moved in with a real sheethead who was into God knows what. And guess who's there? Patrick. He's now almost a foot shorter than me, skinny as a middle school girl, and was undoubtedly on meth. I later found out he also did heroin and a myriad of other drugs. We end up talking, and I tell him about how I have sinus trouble because of the beating I got from him and his friends. He laughed. I looked around at my younger brother, who had got very skinny from not eating, and sister, the environment they were in, and right then I made a decision. I turned to my mother and said, "I don't give a shit if this is the kind of people you want to be around," indicating the piece of sheet next to me, "but we are leaving." So I piled my siblings in my car and brought them home with me. They shortly moved in with my father officially and have been much better off since. Patrick made a comment about me disrespecting him and my mother, and I told him he had no respect for himself obviously, so who is he to talk like that? He went to hit me and I just stared at him. He dropped his fist quick after I stared him down for what felt like an hour. TLDR, met middle school bully, he's a meth head, was living with my mother, took my siblings, and left after verbally sparring with him. Feels good man. Edit. Wow, this got a lot more calmer than I thought. Didn't have time to write this up earlier, but to clear a few things up. He didn't have sex with my mother. I don't think. He was basically just there all the time like drugs addicts are wont to do. My mother was living and faking her boyfriend at the time, whose house it actually was. And the thought of snapping him like a twig did occur to me, but that paled in comparison to what he was doing to himself. If he didn't clean his ways up by now, he's likely dead or in prison getting ass wrapped daily. Beating the shit out of him wouldn't have made me feel any better. Plus it's a lot easier on the knuckles. Background: I was bullied a lot in middle school and, for unrelated reasons, ended up going to a different high school from most of my classmates and obviously didn't keep in touch. I was back home from college for Christmas a year or 2 ago and was at the mall with my little sister and my fiance. I recognized a girl from my middle school across the food court, but we had never been friends, so I simply made a mental note that she was there and went back to eating. A few moments later my fiance and sister both got up to use the restroom, and I was by myself. The girl gets up, comes over, makes nice for half a second, "Oh hi, how are you? Haven't seen you in forever, blah blah," and then immediately transitions into how I look pathetic and desperate sitting by myself, and how it's no wonder the people I was with left. I'm completely taken aback, and it takes me a moment to form words. I hadn't seen this girl in 6 or 7 years and hadn't said more than 5 words to her. I picked up my purse, stood up from my table, and said, "We are grown-ups now," in the most condescending tone I could manage through my surprise. I wanted to say something about how she needed to stop acting like a child, or how there were no teachers around to stop me from leaving, but in that moment I had too many thoughts and couldn't express them all at once eloquently, so I just left. I think, or at least hope, she got the message. I was working in a video rental store in Houston, circa 1989, about 2 years after I graduated high school. In comes a girl that had always been awful to me from 10th grade to graduation. She would cross the room just to say something mean, and I had no history with this girl at all. I had never actually said a word to her. All our exchanges were just her saying something mean to me. I didn't even know her last name. I must have reminded her of someone. She comes into the store and sheepishly said that she wanted 3 dirty movies. She didn't seem to remember me. She said her best friend was getting married and she wanted some dirty movies for the bachelorette party. The shop had a small adult room that you had to access by coming behind the counter, but she didn't want to go in there. She asked me to select 3 films. She was squirming with embarrassment as I tried to find out what she was into and kind of acted like I thought the films were for her and her alone. She said, just grab 3 good ones, I don't care. So I selected 3 all lesbian borns, and she slunk out with them. I would have loved to see the look on their faces when they popped those tapes in. She returned them through the night drop, so she wouldn't have to look anyone in the eye when she brought them back. She rented on her parents' account. I sent a notice through the mail to her parents that Mona's 3-way cunt party had been returned damaged, and they owed us $30. Probably doomed as this thread is large, but I had an experience with an old grade school bully that made me very happy. Was sitting at my house playing video games one day, about a year out of high school, when I heard a knock at my front door. I open it to see, I'll call him Jim, standing on my front porch. He said hello and then immediately just launched into a lengthy apology. He felt horrible for mistreating me and many other nerdy kids back in school. We were in classes together from about 3rd grade through junior year. I was one of the people he had decided to personally track down and speak with. Turns out, he had made some bad mistakes after graduating and spent about 9 months in prison. It was a wake-up call for him. He was sober and really trying to get his life in order. He gave me his phone number and said that I ever felt like getting together, I should give him a call. I called him later that week on a whim, and we ended up becoming good friends for the next 3 years. Unfortunately, he began to slip. I walked into his house as he was doing meth in the living room. I hung out a handful of times after that, but saw him doing worse and worse. Meth was one of the triggers for the violent behavior that got Jim into prison initially. I did not want to see a repeat. So, I quietly took my leave. I haven't spoken with him since. I hope he's doing well. Good guy, at heart.